We're going to, in this next section, talk about rationalism and then existentialism. Now, the rationalism chapter in your text is chapter 6, and a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about is in chapter 6. There are a couple of things we're going to skip, but if you want to, as you kind of think about this, you could be sure that you read along with chapter 6 as you study this when you get ready for your next exam. So, excuse me. Before we did our midterm, we finished up with empiricism, the British and Scottish guys, the empiricists. And now we're shifting a little bit and going to think about rationalism, which is doesn't necessarily come after empiricism. Lots of this stuff is happening all at the same time. But rationalism is another wave of philosophical kinds of thinking about things that really is at the same time distinguishable from empiricism, but there's also some kind of blending together that it comes sometimes. You have to be careful to understand that there's lots of thinkers and lots of ideas that are not purely empirical or purely rational. Most of them aren't pure at all. They're mixed together, but they may kind of lean more one way than the other, and that's maybe why they get classified as rationalists or empiricists. In any case, rationalism as a movement has some real specific things about it that contrast it with empiricism, which we've already talked about quite a bit. The empiricists kind of propose a passive mind, a mind that really gains everything that it has from the environment and from the experience of a person's environment. So empiricism, and we know that, we think of empiricism as knowledge that's gained from experience. Well, the rationalists didn't deny the concept of experience at all, but what the rationalists said was, and maybe the most distinguishing quality is that they propose that the mind is always active. It's not passive. It's not just acted upon by the environment, but the mind is actually acting on the information that we get from the environment. So one of the chief differences between classifying someone as an empiricist or a rationalist would probably be that we say that if we're rationalists, we say that that the mind is very active. Okay. The second thing, very much related to what I just said, knowledge for the rationalist can't come from experience alone. Some knowledge may come from experience, but not by itself. Something has to happen to that experience. It's almost like it's almost like if you think about a computer system, and you think, well, there's data that comes into the computer, and then the computer does something with data and then shares it with me. Okay. Well, the empiricist might say that I just experience the data. Okay. The rationalist would say that the mind kind of functions like your computer. Data comes in, information comes in, and then the computer turns it into something that then I experience totally differently because of the active thing that happens within the computer. Okay, so the mind is like that. The mind is active. The mind is working on data, working on information, and so knowledge that we get can't just come from the experience. It has to come from something that the mind does with the experience. Okay. The third thing that happens in rationalism that's a little bit different is that the rationalists believe that behavior and decisions that we make and those types of things are governed or should be governed by moral principles. That is, things that we decide, things that we think, choices, decisions, as opposed to the influence of something outside of us. Your text, for example, says that for the empiricist, experience, memory, association, hedonism, all those things determine how we think and act, but also our morality. For the rationalist, we should think about what our morality is. That rationalism, the mind, determines morality, not something else. Now, that's an important kind of thing, because as the mind, if the mind can not only give us experience and information, but the mind also helps us determine what is moral and ethical and what is not, then we're getting pretty close to not having a need for anything else that tells us what's moral or what's ethical. And that's one of the places where the rationalists begin to push us a little bit further from the idea of God in some places. So the fourth thing on the list there is that the rationalists propose that we get knowledge, we learn things through deduction rather than induction. Your text says this, the empiricists stressed induction, the acquisition of knowledge through sensory experience and generalizations drawn from that. The rationalists stressed deduction. Okay? In fact, so we don't just get experience and then draw conclusions from our experience. We have thoughts and ideas, and we understand our experience through those thoughts and ideas. And some of those thoughts or ideas, rationalists believe, exist prior to the experience. Okay? And we'll talk about what that means and what some of those are. So we have four real distinctions here: an active mind rather than a passive mind. The idea that knowledge can't come from just experience. It has to be mediated or worked on by the mind. The idea that not only our behavior and our decision making, but our morality comes from the mind. And that we use deductive thinking rather than inductive thinking. We don't just glean things from experience and know them. We have to filter those through something else in order to have knowledge. So, basic principles. Now, the first person that falls into this category of rationalism is Baruch Spinoza, sometimes called Benedict Spinoza. Now, Spinoza is sometimes even thought of as the first kind of psychologist, or at least the first philosophical psychologist. Sometimes, as far as empiricists and rationalists go, sometimes Descartes is thought of as kind of the first philosophical psychologist, the one that kind of does the first bit of philosophy that makes the most sense as a psychological approach. But Spinoza is sometimes too, mostly because Spinoza comes up with this kind of deterministic kind of idea that sounds a lot like Freud at some point. So Spinoza sometimes is considered to be really foundational in terms of psychology becoming a thing. Now, Spinoza has a little bit of an interesting history. He's Dutch. He's born to Portuguese Jewish parents, but he lives in a very Christian environment. Holland is very Christian. And so he lives in Amsterdam, and Amsterdam is a very Christian city at this time. And so Spinoza would have been okay there being Jewish, but he's not okay there when he starts to really mess with people's idea of God, and that's kind of what he does. And so Spinoza has kind of an interesting life there as a Dutch Jew who becomes a little bit at odds with the Christian community. Now, one of the reasons that he does this is that Spinoza believes that, as opposed to Descartes kind of proposed that God and the mind and nature are separate entities. And Spinoza said that he really believed that God and mind and nature are all kind of one power. And in fact, he thought of God as a sense of power, not a person. And that's what really irritated the church. In fact, he was excommunicated from the church. Young people were taught to not read Spinoza, to not hang out with him, to not be in the same room with him, because he had basically taken this heretical position that God was not a person, that God was power. And that sense of God as power meant that God was in the mind and God was in nature, and it's all one big thing, which becomes basically pantheism, which is the notion that God is in everything. And so Spinoza proposes that God exists, that he doesn't get rid of God, but he proposes that God exists in everything, everywhere, all the time. And that, of course, doesn't go over well with either Jews or Christians. And so Spinoza has some social trouble there. Now, when he dealt with the notion of something like mind and body, Spinoza is one of those who proposes what's called double aspectism, which is that notion that the mind and body are two sides of the same coin. They're working together, they're kind of parallel, but they're very different. So they're connected, parallel, moving through time and space together, but different parts, different entities. Okay. Now, Spinoza also messes with the church a little bit because he doesn't believe that we have free will, and Christians don't like that, and Jews didn't really like that either. Spinoza believed that we have the illusion of free will. In fact, your textbook says this: according to Spinoza, free will is a fiction. In the mind, there is no absolute or free will, but the mind is determined to wish this or that by a cause, which has also been determined by another cause, and this was determined by another cause. So what we have there is we have natural law. Something happens because something happened before it to cause it, and something happened before that to cause it. And so we're just kind of rolling along and things are happening, but we have the sense that we make choices. Spinoza said this: men think themselves free inasmuch as they are conscious of their volitions and desires, and never even dream in their ignorance of the causes which have disposed them so to wish and desire. Okay? According to Spinoza, it makes no sense to view God as the cause of all things, and at the same time to believe that humans possess free will. So Spinoza couldn't put those two things together, total free will and God is a cause of all things, and so he just didn't. He just said we don't have free will. We think that we do. We think that we're free. We think that we have free will to choose, but it's an illusion. In truth, everything that happens is governed by natural law. Now, of course, then that doesn't help with his relationship with the church again, because the church wanted people to be free and independent and God to be an intervening God that made things happen all the time, not just natural law. Spinoza's notion of God is this force of nature, and everything is kind of going and happening, but God does not intervene. God is not personal. God is not messing with our lives. God is not changing things as we go along. Everything is just governed by natural law. Now, Spinoza also kind of proposes this, what he says there on the screen, non-empirical determinism kind of an idea. That is what gets him kind of connected with Freud. In your text, it says this. It says, Spinoza's insistence that we can improve ourselves by clarifying our ideas through an analysis of those ideas and rationally controlling our passion comes very close to Freudian psychoanalysis. In fact, if we replace the term passion with unconscious determinants, we see how similar Spinoza's position is to Freud. So Spinoza thought that if we could analyze our thoughts, analyze ourselves enough, and decide to behave and think in certain ways, that helped us become okay. It's very much like the notion of Freudian analysis, except that Spinoza is about analyzing our rational thought processes. And this sounded, if you read Spinoza and you think if you spend much time on this, it begins to sound a lot like the things that Freud came up with. And it's probably true that Freud was familiar with Spinoza and may have kind of adapted that into his own scheme of thinking. Okay, so Spinoza is our first kind of rationalist philosopher and begins to kind of connect us with psychology a little bit. Now, before we move on to talk about Immanuel Kant, I want to mention to you in your chapter on rationalism, there's a section on Gottfried Leibniz. Leibniz is not terribly important to us, but I want to point out a couple of things about Leibniz that you should be aware of. You should read this section on Leibniz and just because there's a couple of interesting things, and I'll point these out to you. For example, Leibniz, there's a section on his disagreement with John Locke. If you remember, John Locke was the empiricist that gave us the idea of the tabula rasa, the blank slate. And Locke said that there's nothing that we experience that hasn't been begotten by the senses. Well, Leibniz takes that and says, well, really, here's the best way to think of it. There's nothing that we know that hasn't been begotten by the senses except the mind. The mind exists independent of the senses. So Leibniz proposes that everything that we know is not begotten by the senses. It's actually begotten by the senses through the process of the mind. And so, again, they're not denying empiricism, but they're saying that the mind is a part of that mix, and the mind is the most important part of that mix. Now, another thing I want to mention to you about Leibniz is that Leibniz has this idea of pre-established harmony. This is one of the things that Leibniz does that's kind of like the idea of natural law, but it's a little bit more fleshed out. For example, Leibniz talks about the notion of psychophysical parallelism based on the notion of pre-established harmony. Leibniz proposed that everything in the universe is made of these entities, life units, he called them, called monads. Okay, a monad, that means a singular thing. Okay, and Leibniz believed that everything was a monad or composed of monads, and that monads were all created and set in motion, basically, and ran in perfect parallel harmony from the beginning of time through eternity. So the mind, the body, nature, everything exists in this kind of pre-established harmony. And that's kind of how he explained natural law. He used the analogy of clocks. In your text it says Leibniz asked that we imagine two identical perfect clocks that have been set to the same time at the same moment. Afterward, the clocks will always be in agreement but will not interact. According to Leibniz, all monads, including those constituting the mind and the body, are like such clocks. They exist in pre-established harmony. Okay, so Leibniz has an interesting idea there. The other thing I wanted to mention to you from Leibniz is the notion of perception and the law of continuity. Leibniz says that, and I think this is an interesting kind of an idea, Leibniz proposes that nothing happens at once, that everything happens in steps. And some things, even if they seem to happen all at once, actually happen in minute, tiny steps. Okay? It says this in your text: nothing takes place suddenly. That is one of my great and best confirmed maxims, that nature never makes leaps. It's one of Leibniz's kind of most famous idea, that there's never such a thing as a leap in nature. Everything happens by tiny, tiny steps. This is the law of continuity. There is much work for this law to do in natural science. It implies that any change from small to large, or vice versa, passes through something which is in respect of degrees as well as parts in between, and no motion ever springs immediately from a state of rest, or passes into one, except through a lesser motion. Just as one could never traverse a certain distance without first traversing a shorter distance. Okay? So Leibniz proposes to us that nothing happens immediately. There is no leap in nature. Everything is small, 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 small movements. Okay? Now, Leibniz then takes us to Immanuel Kant. Now, as far as rationalists go, Kant is kind of the number one guy. There's nobody who's a more important rationalist philosopher than Immanuel Kant. And you can see that with Kant, we're getting more contemporary. Kant dies in 1804, so we're getting closer and closer to kind of contemporary thinking. Now, Kant is a German, of course. He's brilliant, and he has this very interesting but boring kind of life. You can see there he goes to the University of Königsberg when he's 16, and he stays there until he's 73 years old. Never goes more than 40 miles from his home. In fact, he had, your text says at one point, it says Kant's life was a life of thought. His pen was his scepter, his desk was his kingdom, and his armchair was his throne. He led an uneventful life, no change, no travel, no reaching out for the unusual, not much interest outside his study room and his university classroom. He was more punctual and precise than the town clocks. The old story is that the housewives in Königsberg would set their clocks by Kant every day, because he would leave his office and he would walk for 30 minutes at lunch, and when they saw him pass by, they would know to check their clocks and make sure what time it was, because he passed their house at exactly the same time every day. So he's probably not terribly interesting in terms of his own experience, but Kant is incredibly important in terms of rationalist philosophy. One of the main things, maybe the most important thing that Kant does, is he contributes the idea of the categories of thought. Now, Kant says that, like all the rationalists basically do, that all of our experience is mediated by a priori mental processes, that the mind pre-exists our experience. So our experience is only valid in that it's translated, it's mediated, it's understood through the mind. So Kant proposes that before experience, we have in us categories, what he calls categories of thought. He says that they are a priori, that is, they exist before. Okay? They are before. So a priori means that something is pre-existent. In the case of a human, it means that it's built into me, that I come with these a priori categories of thought. Okay? That's one of the foundational ideas of rationalism. Now we'll come back to that in a minute. Kant proposed also that everything we think we know is determined by the mind. Now other people, Spinoza has said this, Leibniz has said this, other people have said this. Kant has more impact. Kant solidifies this notion, and Kant becomes kind of the father of this notion that everything is determined by the mind. And so for Kant, the mind really becomes the center of everything. Now again, I want you to always put this in context. Remember that when philosophers do this, if the mind becomes the center of the universe, then that begins to, again, chip away at the notion of God, or basically to kind of just set it aside kind of totally. If the mind is the center of the universe, then everything about that I might think even about God comes from my mind. It doesn't come from God. That's why people of faith over the centuries have had so much. It's one of the reasons why they've always struggled with philosophy. That's one of the reasons why even today, even well-educated, intelligent Christian people will have a little bit of fear of philosophy, because they think, well, if you think too much about this, you'll lose your faith. One of the reasons is because the philosophers took positions like this, like Kant, to say that the mind is the center of everything. And if you're a believer in any kind of faith, you probably think that thing that you worship is really the center of everything and the source of everything. For the rationalists, the mind kind of begins to take that over, and cognitive processes begin to kind of take over that place that might have been totally reserved for God. Now, Kant proposes these categories of thought. Now, the categories of thought are these things that pre-exist in our mind, and all of our experience that comes in has to somehow work through or be filtered through or be transformed by those a priori categories of thought. Okay, and some of those are these: time, space, cause and effect. Those are all products of categories of thought. Now, before we move on, let's think about how that might work and why that might make sense. If as you sit in front of your computer or wherever, however you're doing this, you have some sense that from the time I started this video, or from the time you started watching this video until now, time has passed. Now, there's a sense in which you might say, well, I know that because I've got, like, you may be like me, I've got a clock on my wall right there behind the computer screen. So you may think, well, I know that because there's a clock. I know that because I looked at my phone before I started. Or I know that because I've watched the sun move outside my window. Well, that may be kind of true, but Kant proposed that you have some sense of time passing even without any of those things. You might not even know what to call it. If you didn't have a language, you wouldn't necessarily know to say that that's time. But Kant proposed that you have some sense that 20 minutes ago is different than now. You have a sense of time passing, and that's built into your mind. You don't get that through experience. You may learn that as time passes, the sun moves or the clock changes, but you have an innate sense of time. You have the same innate sense of space. Okay? I can hold my hand right here and move my hand over here, and you know, and I know, that my hand is in a different position. That's a priori, according to Kant. That's built in. No one has to teach me that. It's just my mind gets it instantaneously. Okay? So Kant said there were these things like time and space, like cause and effect, like the idea that if I hold this stack of Post-it notes up here and I drop it, that my dropping is what caused it to fall. Okay? And when it drops, it makes a sound. Well, I could also say that when it hits the paper, it makes a sound. That's cause and effect. Now Kant said you don't need anybody to teach you that. It's immediate. It's already there. Okay? He called this Anschauung. Now I like that because there are some German words that show up that aren't really translatable. Anschauung means kind of like it's immediately recognized. It's immediately sensed. Okay? So like time is immediately recognized. Space is immediately recognized. Cause and effect is immediately recognized. No one has to say to you, now let me explain to you how time passed. You just know it. Okay? And the word that Kant used for that is Anschauung. It's immediately known. Okay? So Kant says experience gives us information, but only the mind can get truth from that experience. Again, it's kind of like data going into a computer. Okay? I need that data to be translated, to be mediated, to be worked through so that I can know what it means. And Kant basically, of course, way before there was a computer, Kant said that's what your mind does. Your mind takes in sight, sound, color, texture, every billion, all the billions of things that your mind takes in, and it gets something from that so that I can say, oh, that's green, that's purple, this is hard, this is flat, that tasted good. But all of that happens because sensory experience is filtered through the categories of thought. And that's the only way I know what it is. That's the only way I know what it really is, because of the mind. Not because of the experience, but because of the mind. Now, as I said a while ago, that extends not only to things that I think I know in terms of what's purple or what's smooth or what's heavy or light, but it extends into our morality. In fact, Kant comes up with this notion of the categorical imperative. Now, the categorical imperative sounds a little bit like the Christian version of the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, Kant proposes that as a moral maxim, okay? And Kant says it this way. He says, I should never act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become universal law. So basically what Kant is proposing is that you never decide that something is right or good or true for you unless you're willing for that to become absolutely universally true. So it could be true for everyone. It's a little bit like doing unto others only as you would have them do unto you. So I'm going to do this thing to you, but I should only do that if I'm absolutely okay with you being able to also do that to me. Okay? The categorical imperative is that I should never act except in such a way that if you took my action and you applied it universally, that would be fine. Okay? Now, the important thing here is not so much the content. The important thing is here is that this is a moral position, a moral stance that is done rationally. It's not emotional. It's not based on my experience. It's a rational process. Morality becomes something that the mind produces. Okay? It's a little bit hard to explain it. Well, okay, I don't want to over-explain it. I've said it several times. Okay, so morality, like everything else, kind of becomes rationalized. Okay, now what this means then is that when morality becomes something that is also something that's a product of the mind, that means, and I kind of said this a while ago, that God really kind of becomes a product of the mind. If God can only be proved through moral law, which comes from my mind, then I'm proving God with my mind. Okay? And Kant kind of proposed that we know that maybe if we say that there's a God, we know that there's a God because moral law exists. That's not an unusual argument. Some people might say, I know that there is a God because good exists, or because love exists, or because mercy exists, and I can see that, so there must be a God because people couldn't have come up with that. Well, this is kind of like that argument, that God can only be proved through the idea of moral law, morality. And morality is something that is a product of the mind. So you can see that this doesn't leave a lot of room for the traditional, or what most Western Christian people would think of as what God is. God is really a product of the mind. Okay. Now, Kant has a tremendous amount of impact on us. He becomes, as I said, he kind of becomes the real father of rationalist kinds of thinking. And he basically sets up the stage for others to come along. The next one that we want to talk about is Hegel. Okay, now Hegel is, of course, also a German. You can see that Hegel comes along just a little bit later than Kant did, born in 1770 and dies in 1831. Hegel is a little bit different because Hegel really kind of has room in his philosophy for a concept of God that is different than what Kant has proposed, and even different than what Spinoza has proposed. Hegel saw the universe. There are some things in common there. Spinoza's notion of unified power. Hegel saw that, and Hegel really kind of embraced that notion of God, mind, nature, all of that being this one kind of power. Hegel called that the absolute. Okay, he theologized it a little bit. Okay, because whereas Spinoza looks at it as the unity of all power, kind of in a way. Hegel goes a little bit farther. Hegel says it's that same concept that came up with the Greeks as the unmoved mover. Hegel buys into that. Hegel thinks of it as it's kind of like if we took that's why I put this on here. We took Plato's form of the good and the notion of the unmoved mover that we get from Aristotle and Spinoza's concept of unified power. And Hegel calls it the concept of all concepts, and says at some point it becomes the God who is worshipped in religion. Now when that happens, he says philosophy then culminates in speculative theology. So Hegel doesn't really do this. He doesn't propose, he's not a theologian, he doesn't propose a God, and he doesn't describe that God, and he doesn't spend a lot of time on God. But Hegel kind of says that this thing, this absolute, and that's what he calls it. He calls it the absolute. He never talks about it really as God. But he says that the absolute that he describes at some point becomes like the God who is worshipped in religion. Okay, the concept of all concepts, the eternal absolute. He disagreed with the church a lot, but he did have some sympathy. In fact, I'm reading your text. Your text says he has sympathy toward Christian theology. That's probably a really good way to put it. Okay. Hegel also proposes what's called a dialectic process. Now, this is an interesting thing because Hegel says we get to knowledge through the mind, of course, because he's a good rationalist, and we get to knowledge through the mind, but there's a real specific way that we do that. We do this by this process that he called thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Hegel said that throughout history, knowledge, what we think of as true and real, evolves, and the way that it evolves is that someone proposes a thesis, an idea, and then someone proposes an antithesis to that, a challenging idea. And then we learn and we work and we argue and we think, and at some point, and it may be within 2 minutes or it may be within 200 years, there is a synthesis, a bringing together of something that makes sense of the thesis and the antithesis. And then at that point, this synthesis becomes the new thesis. And then we challenge that with an antithesis. And then over time, we develop a new synthesis. And then that synthesis becomes a thesis. So Hegel said that over time, that's how we learn. That's how we move toward knowledge. And that's how we move toward the absolute, this perfect concept of all concepts. We do that by synthesis, antithesis, by thesis, antithesis, synthesis, over and over and over. That moves us closer and closer and closer and closer to the notion of the absolute. Just like Plato would have said, that moves us closer and closer and closer and closer to the form of the good at some point, the unmoved mover. Okay, so Hegel presents this thing that's a little bit like theology, but is still a rationalist philosophy because all of this process is still happening because of the power of the mind, because we're thinking. Okay. In fact, Hegel says our sensory impressions, the things that we feel or see or touch or taste, are of very little use unless we can do something with them in the mind and determine what they really mean or what they symbolize for us. Okay. Now, Hegel is pretty influential in 2 or 3 real specific ways. He's influential in that he influences Gestalt psychology because of his focus on the whole. One of the things that Hegel did that you may not like so much is that Hegel really did not care much for the notion of the individual. In fact, this idea of the absolute for Hegel kind of dominated everything, such that the notion of the individual person was not important to Hegel. It didn't matter to him very much. The value for Hegel was not in the individual, it was in the collective, it was in the whole. Okay? Because of that, Hegel becomes one of the people that kind of gives this foundational a theory for some Marxist thinkers, because Hegel believes that the individual only exists to serve the whole. Okay, it's a very kind of Marxist, communistic kind of approach. Hegel believed that the state was what's important, not the individual. Okay, so one of the things that contemporary thinkers might not like at all about Hegel was that because he was kind of dominated by this notion of the absolute, for Hegel, the independent individual person was not really that important. What was important was the absolute, and our culture, our society, our collective moving toward understanding the absolute. So his focus on wholeness instead of part is probably a foundational idea for Gestalt psychology. He probably is he is a foundational philosopher for Marxism, state versus the individual. He's a foundational philosopher for the emergence of existentialism, because he believed that the person who sees themselves as up against the absolute experiences alienation, experiences this notion that, wow, there is this absolute something, and I am so qualitatively different than that something. And there's that sense of isolation. Which when we look at Christian existentialism, Kierkegaard would say that when I experience that there's a God and then there's me, and I'm so totally different and pitiful when thrown up next to that God, well, that's how I understand who I am. Well, Hegel said that's true, but Hegel did it in a little bit more of an atheistic way, and said that when we set ourselves up against this perfect notion of the absolute, we're alienated. We realize how pitiful and worthless we are. Okay. So Hegel influences Gestalt, he influences Marxist thinking and ultimately communist thinking. He influences existential philosophy and theology. He influences lots of contemporary German theologians like Karl Barth and Paul Tillich. Those guys all have this underlying notion of the individual up against the absolute that they all get from Hegel. Okay. Now, rationalism and empiricism then lead us to this notion of the Enlightenment. Okay, we've moved away from the Dark Ages, away from these ideas of everything being governed by ghosts and spirits and witches and wizards and all of that stuff. And with our newfound rationalism and empiricism, we've pushed religion out just a little bit, and we're much more interested in rationalist processes and educational processes. And that's what the Enlightenment becomes. And that Enlightenment then leads us to the point where we're ready to embrace Romanticism and existentialism. And so in the next video we'll begin to talk about existentialism.